Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the 12th Annual Wild Wisconsin Winter Web Conference. I'm Jamie Machik with the Wisconsin Valley Library Service, and today I'm moderating the marketing track. And assisting me with this webinar is Shauna Kasegi, and she is with the Southwest Wisconsin Library System. And we are very glad to have you all here. We are kicking off the marketing track with a session on color theory. And we have Laura Solomon with us. And Laura is the Library Services Manager with the Ohio Public Library Information Network, or OPLIN. And if she sounds familiar, it's because she has presented for a few Wild Wisconsin conferences, a few tech days that we've had. And we're just so glad to have her here to talk about color theory. So Laura, whenever you're ready.
Thanks, Jamie. Thanks, everyone. I mentioned that my favorite color way back at the beginning of the chat is green because it represents, at least to me, everything not winter. I am not a winter fan, which is why I don't love where I live, which is Northeast Ohio in the snow belt. So there's that. So I love green. And thank you for those folks who have been sharing their favorite colors in the chat. Please go ahead and continue to do that. I think it's very interesting, especially in the light of how we're going to be covering these, well, probably almost all of these specific colors at some point today. So I want to give you a breakdown of what we're going to be looking at today. So here's my quick and dirty agenda. We're going to do some very basic color theory. I am not a color theory junkie. There's a lot out there. If you want to do a deep dive on color theory and different models, you could be very, very happy for a very long time. I'm not here to do that. And honestly, even if I could do that, probably all of our collective eyes would glaze over. But I am going to give you just enough to hopefully give you some idea to maybe use as a foundation really for what's coming up for the rest of the time. We will look at some different color models as they apply to basically to digital. So for folks here who are perhaps more on the print side of things, you may be sort of wiggling in your seats going, but that's not what we use. And that's okay. I understand that. And hopefully folks understand, or at least will understand that not everything applies to everything. That's okay. We will, of course, spend a lot of time on which color to use for what. And we'll talk about why that may or may not be a good approach. And of course, some best practices. Now that I've gone through all of that, though, I do want to say, whether you've seen me before or whether you haven't, I really enjoy directly engaging with folks as you're chatting in the chat. Or if you have questions, comments, whatever, your own experiences, put those into the chat as well. I'm generally keeping one eye on the chat as I'm presenting, and I'm pretty good at interrupting myself and putting myself back on track. So I'm glad many of you already know where the chat is and have been using it. Please continue to use it liberally. That will make for a much better presentation for everyone, because sometimes, honestly, the best information you get is information from other people who are not the person who's yakking at you for an hour or so. Having said all that, let's start with some really basic color theory. Color theory can help anybody, whether you are a professional graphic artist, or you're a hack, or you're someone who's just really likes Canva, or you're somewhere in between. It really doesn't matter, because when you have good color combinations, your product is going to be, no big surprise, much better. Since painting and art probably began, artists have been kind of eyeballing color combinations. And of course, some of us are better at it than others. My husband will be the first to tell you that he is not good at it, and he leaves all of that kind of decision making to me. And that's perfectly okay. I enjoy doing that. He has no interest whatsoever. But color theory is the science behind all of this. And when we start looking at things online, sometimes it's really apparent that, like, oh, that's a really good choice, at least if we start thinking about it. Sometimes it's good and we don't think about it and we just go, oh, that's, we just pass it over because it's not attracting our attention. A lot of times, I think anyway, sometimes things that are not good can attract more attention than things that are good, but that's my own experience and opinion. But color theory brings logic and kind of a rule-based structure to not to the process and not just eyeballing it. Some people still eyeball, and of course that's always going to be a thing. But color theory can make the difference between creating something really good or something that is just a hot mess. And so professionals tend to use color theory to make things better, to make better art. And when we're talking about digital content, digital promotions, all of that really is typically art, because we need it to either attract attention or we need it to inspire a specific feeling or action. So you probably remember from back in maybe even your kindergarten days, although I don't know what kindergarten is like anymore. But way back, you saw something called the color wheel, which is it's just a visual representation of the colors in the visible spectrum. So it's a really basic tool that everybody should have in their toolbox. And this is probably not a new idea for you. It's divided usually into 6 simple colors: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and purple, which is not exactly the same, by the way, you may have already noticed, as Roy G. Biv. Roy G. Biv has an additional color in there and also kind of splits purple into two other shades. But those hues that I just mentioned, those 6, are divided into different shades, different tones. And it's a really good way to visualize how colors interact with each other. It's simple to just sit here and be like, okay, there's blue, red, yellow, so forth. But when we're talking about promotions, what we really are interested in is how those colors interact with each other and how you can make good or bad combinations out of them. So a little bit of history about where this came from, because of course, like everything else, it just didn't pop up out of the ether. But the first color wheel was actually invented. Let's try invented. Boy, you can tell I've been cutting back on my caffeine. It's clearly apparent. Sir Isaac Newton back in 1666. And he looked and saw that when light passes through a prism, it's dispersed into the spectrum of colors. And he used that information to create a circular diagram that showed the relationships between those colors. And that's been used by artists and designers probably now centuries, right? To create better, hopefully, color palettes and to manipulate colors in visual media. But the modern color wheel, as we usually know it, was actually developed in the 18th century by a French artist named Johannes Itten. His color broke color down into 3 primary colors, red, yellow, and blue, and 3 secondary colors, green, orange, and yellow. And this sort of points to that idea of how these mix rather than just sitting there. So we actually end up with something like this, although this also shows complementary colors. So you may have seen something like this before. This is one of my favorite color wheels, I guess, in the sense that it has very strict borders. I'm going to show you something in a minute that will help you understand why I say that. But I find this particularly useful because when we're talking about color combinations, it's often a good idea to use things that are completely opposite from one another. And part of that has to do with contrast also. But if you've ever wondered, like, Christmas is red and green, is that a good combination? Why, yes, it is. Red and green are complementary colors. And they're both actually, well, red is a primary here, green, not so much. But nonetheless, moving on, you've probably seen something like this. Now, the color wheel I just showed you, which is very much like the one on the left here, is not actually what a real color wheel probably looks like, because the color wheel that's described in traditional color theory usually is visualized as having these very clear, defined boundaries. But in reality, and you know this if you've probably used any kind of graphic design software where you could pick a color, there are millions of colors and they blend into each other. So what you see on the left is kind of dumbed down in some ways so that humans can use this effectively. But the reality of colors is that we're really working with something more on the right. How many of you have used a color picker tool, by the way, that looks something like this colorful gradient here on the right? Let me know in the chat. Oh, definitely got a couple already. Good. Regularly, says Mackenzie, on Canva all the time. Good. So this is familiar. In fact, I would be shocked if you were using something to the left, because that's, I don't know, what, less, it's got 10 or a dozen colors or something. I can't even, maybe MS Paint back in the day had something like that, but most things these days have something like the one on the right, where we're looking at about probably 216 million colors if we're talking about the digital. So the thing is, though, about the one on the right, as that is accurate as that is, it's very difficult to work with from a human perspective when we're talking about combinations. We can pick colors out of the one on the right, obviously, and it looks like we all do. But in terms of what works with what, that's where things get a little trickier. And that's where color theory can come in. Knowing just how a basic color wheel works can give you a stronger foundation, because I don't know. I know some folks are very particular about things that they like as far as color combinations go, but I'm sure that everyone here can name something that they have seen online, and it doesn't have to be from a library, where that person's favorite color combination may not be awesome. It does not look great. So for one example I think of is, for example, I've seen a lot of like royal blue on black, which is very hard to see and not a good combination. Of course, black is not really on the color wheel because it's the absence of color. But I'm sure, in fact, put in the chat if you can think of color combinations you've seen that made you go, maybe not. Another one I can think, black is a big one. It doesn't pair great with everything, especially in certain contexts. Red on purple, says Jamie. Oh, yeah, that might be a hard sell. Orange and purple, says Jessica. So we've got a few here already. Keep putting those into the chat. So we already know that some combinations, green and orange, says Maggie. Yellow letters on anything is difficult to see, says Niyama. I hope I said that right. If not, I apologize. Jamie says green and yellow, good for Packers uniforms, but that's about it. Green and yellow, not popular, because Joseph just chimed in with that. Red and green for those with color blindness, says Katie. Yes, and that's not even something I'm going to touch on here. There's actually different forms of color blindness, but the one that probably most of us know is red and green. So that's something else. Oh, and Bridget says yellow and red, but works for McDonald's. Yes, right? That's red is commonly used in fast food for a reason. And maybe we'll touch on that when we start talking about red. So for those of you who are color theory nerds, this is a great place to find out a lot more. I've got the URL there if you want to grab it, or I think you'll get the recording or the slides later. This is way more than you will probably ever need unless you maybe work very heavily in color, and maybe print also may have some more of this. Digital does have some of this, but not all of this. So I don't want to overwhelm you. I just want you to be thinking along the lines of combining colors and how do people perceive those colors. That's really what we're about here today. So when it comes to using color online, we have a few different options, and there's different models of these. And I bet as I talk about these, you're going to probably recognize at least one or two, because even if you're not sure what they mean, chances are you've seen how they are expressed in different kinds of design software, especially if you've been using something like a color picker. Usually when you use a color picker, you've got some kind of eyedrop, you click on the spot on the color, could be a wheel, could be a square, could be anything with that gradient of colors. And it comes up and it gives you some kind of combination, usually of letters or numbers or something like that. And that represents that very specific shade of that color. But when we talk about digital things, there are typically 3 different models that get used, although there are many more than that. Probably the one that's used the most, and if there are any web folks here, you can relate to this, are hex or hexadecimal codes. And so these are the most common values that are used for online designs. Now, what's interesting for those of you who work in both the digital realm and the print realm, you may already be thinking in your head, but Laura, hex codes are not great for printers. And you would be right. generally when you are using, and probably for any of these that I'm going to show you, usually these have to be converted in some way, often to PMS or Pantone colors for print. Some printers may work with these, I'm not sure, but generally they're not quite the same. They're very, very close, but not exactly the same. That's what I've been told by people who work in print. And if anyone here wants to talk about that in the comments, please do that. I don't do print, which is why this is called Color Me Digital. But hex codes are the primary one that's used for most things, not the only, but the way the hexadecimal code works, you may have seen something like this. First, you have the hashtag at the first place there over on the left, which usually gives it away as being hexadecimal. But these are always 6-digit or really 6-character codes. Anybody use these? If you're doing any kind of web design, you are absolutely using hexadecimal probably as your primary form of expressing a color. And Lori says, yep, okay, we got a good number of people already saying yes. And Gina says, yes, on website. And that's exactly right. You can use the other 2 color models I mentioned, but they're not usually as common. And Mackenzie says, I have, but never understood what they mean. So I won't go into the nerdy stuff here, Mackenzie, but basically these are representing, as you can see here on the screen, the red, green, and the blue values. How much red, how much green, how much blue. And Chris says, yes, we use hex codes. I also have the colors in their CMYK values for printing. Yes, so that's, as Chris has pointed out, there are 2 different things that have to be converted depending on what medium you're working in. So the amount of each color here is expressed by a combination of a number and or a letter. If you want to know exactly how this works, hit me up afterwards. I'll be happy to send you a link where this will explain in great painful detail about what that is. And Jamie says, is there an easy way to find the complementary hex code if you happen to find a color you like with the eyedropper? It depends on, Jamie, it kind of depends on where you're using the eyedropper. So for example, if you're using something like PaintShop Pro or Photoshop and GIMP, there's tools there that can convert one from the other, and that really differs in how that happens. There are definitely online tools also. You just Google convert hex code to whatever that is, and you will come up with a multitude of tools to do this if you don't have one of these more robust graphic programs. But you may not need to do that. Many things use hexadecimal for sure. So let me show you something here. There we go. And actually, I think someone was asking, Kristen was asking about the link. Actually, the link is on this slide that will give you the geeky breakdown of how hexadecimal works. You know, if you're ever going to be on Color Theory Jeopardy, you might need to know that. But here's just some example of what, again, there's like 216 million colors digitally. This is a very, very small sample, but this is what it looks like if you were to say, okay, give me a color spectrum of some blues and some greens. What would that look like in hexadecimal? And Maggie says, it's fun explaining CYMK when I teach painting classes in our makerspace because it's good practice to use those tones in paint too. Lots of our patrons go, wait, for real. That makes sense to me. You're talking about the physical realm rather than the digital. And with digital, you have to think about how a color is being displayed on a monitor. That's really where a lot of color stuff comes down to print, which is why I'm always giving out disclaimers that this is not necessarily the same as how the print world works, because there is nothing between the human eye and say a poster, whereas there is a computer and a monitor and the internet and all sorts of things, especially monitors though, going on between the human eye and whatever the thing is that you have on the screen. The next one, and I've already seen a couple people at least in the chat refer to this, is RGB or red, green. I can't talk today, folks. Sorry, red, green, blue. And Barbara says also different monitors and software, the colors will appear differently. And Barbara, you were absolutely right. There's a reason. Some of you may have heard. I'll address this just for a second because I think we have the time. There's also something you may have heard of. It's been around for a long time, called WebSafe Colors, which is actually just a palette of 256 colors, which is nothing when you think about the 200 odd million you've got available now digitally. But when I started doing web work back in, I'm dating myself here heavily, but back in the late 90s, the WebSafe palette was pretty much what we worked with, because the difference between monitors was so extreme that there was no guarantee that, say, this kind of greenish teal color around the circle on my slide here would actually show up as that color. So we could specify a hexadecimal code, but there was no guarantee that's actually what people would see. And in fact, it could be much farther off the mark than you might think. As monitors continue to evolve, then we were able to say pretty reliably that the hexadecimal or the RGB or the HSL code, I'll talk about that in a second, would be rendered in a way that was pretty much what you would see. If your library has very, very specific style guides where everything has to be shown at, usually I get PMS colors when for example, a library sends me a logo and says, here's the logo, but here are the colors that we need for everything else. And they may or may not be attached to that logo. Those usually, sometimes they're nice and they send those to me in hexadecimal codes or even RGB, HSL, but usually I'm going to get PMS or Pantone colors. And so I have to do a little bit of conversion there and hope that that's going to be good enough. And it has to be, because it's digital. I have no control over that. So anyway, that's more than you wanted to know, but things can still appear differently, even if now that we've progressed almost 20 years later, and you don't have to worry quite as much about monitors. So the way that RGB works, in some ways, it's somewhat similar to hexadecimal, where you've got these first three numbers here in the parentheses that are identifying how much red, green, blue that you have, just like the hexadecimal did, even in the same order. But RGB also has a kind of a secret little fun thing, which is why you see here it says RGBA. A stands for alpha. And of course, this is thing that only matters on digital. Print does not have transparency, I don't think. But what A does is alpha. It means there's an alpha channel, which means how transparent is this color? And that's a nice little feature hexadecimal doesn't have, HSL doesn't have. RGB/RGBA does, where that you see that one there over at the end. That means that the color here is, the transparency or the opacity is solid, but you can have a value anywhere from, from 0.0 something 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 to 1 being full opacity. So there's some transparency feature here that you don't have with other color models used online. The last one I'll mention is HSL. And you can see an example of a color slider there. This is actually pulled out of PaintShop Pro, which is what I use. It's roughly equivalent to Photoshop. But hue means color, and it uses the degrees of the color wheel to tell you what color you're on. So if you know the color wheel and the positions of these main colors, you should, in theory, I can't because I'm a color wimp, but you're supposed to be able to tell that 45 degrees will look orange and 270 degrees will look purple just by being able to think about it and do the kind of the conversion in your head. That's more than I can do, and I'm sadly very reliable on these tools to figure that out for me, but I'm also thinking that's kind of why they're there. I don't need to know that. But saturation is essentially how colorful the color is. So 0% saturation means the color will just be some shade of gray. There's essentially no color. It's colorless. While 100% means it's going to be a full strength of whatever that color is. So if you want to mute your color or make it pop a little more, you can just change the saturation value. And the last one, the L, is for lightness, which is how dark or bright the color is. 0% lightness means your color is going to be black, regardless of whatever the hue and the saturation settings are, it's black. This is light and dark, and 0% means no light, so it's black. 100% lightness is going to get you at the other end of that literal spectrum, which is white, because if you put in 100% light, that pretty much wipes out your color settings and says it's white. That's it. 50% usually when you're working with this model will give you about the most accurate version of a color, but of course, like everything, it's adjustable. So you might be wondering at this point, well, Laura, which color model should I be using? For most people who work with colors on computers in digital, the argument's already over. It's going to be one of these three, and hexadecimal is usually the winner with RGB or RGBA slightly behind. There are a bunch of other color models that are not, I didn't list, some of which I had not even heard of until I started diving into this topic a little more deeply, and things I had never even seen. So there are more out there, but for us here today, I can't imagine that we would ever have a use beyond these three. Generally, choosing a color model is a fairly minor, we hope, color design decision, but good things are made with small decisions, right? So we want to make sure that we're using the right color model for the right job. If you're doing something with a poster, you're probably not choosing any of these. If you're trying to do something that spans both digital and print, you're probably going to have to do some kind of conversion at one end or the other of that. And even if you're not the one doing that conversion, so let's say you have something digital and you send the hex codes to your printer, even if you're not doing that conversion, chances are really good your printer is doing some kind of conversion, or your graphic design person is doing some kind of conversion. It's happening somewhere, because those different models, print and digital, rarely overlap. So now we get to the part that everybody usually likes the most. And many of you have already said what your favorite color is. But let me ask you a different question. Not just what is your favorite color, but what is your favorite color to use in your library's marketing? And I'm going to ask you to think about this. It's very easy to say, oh, well, our library's colors are blue and white. So you might say, those are your favorite colors, but are they really the colors you're using all the time in your marketing? That's my question to you. If it's not your library colors, what are the favorite colors you're using in your marketing? Because using the colors of your library, of course, makes great sense, and I won't argue with that, but I bet they're not the only colors. And Joseph says seasonal, so that's interesting. Bridget says colors in our logo. I like to use green a lot. Library colors are blue and gray, so that's a good combination. Rebecca says blues. And Jessica, I like that you're using this as a complementary color to your existing color scheme that you have with your library's logo. I won't be able to read all these. Maggie says, I like using a cream or black background on most of my flyers to make other elements pop. Yep. Kristen says deep purple and cream. Amber says greens. Lori says I use colors matching whatever I'm promoting, e.g. images used, etc. Mackenzie says based on who we are marketing to. And Mackenzie, that is a wonderful segue, because that's kind of where we're going with a lot of this. So let's get started with what colors use. And there's some more answers coming in. And that's perfectly okay. Websites and things that are digital and of course easy to read, like for example the royal blue and black that I mentioned earlier, is not so easy to read. But things that have a consistent color scheme and are easy to read, they're more likely to succeed than those that don't. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone. Couple more content comments have come in. Kristen says we have different colors for kids and adults. And Daniel says we have blue and red in our logos, use those a lot, but depends on graphics I use. Jill says I also like to use colors that are similar to our library colors, greens, tans, and yellows. So lots going on here. Knowing how colors interact with each other can really help you to create better designs, which is why I talk about the color wheel in a little bit of depth at the beginning. Because if you are completely unsure about how to combine these colors, you're probably going to start with your library's colors. So like I mentioned earlier, if let's say your library's logo and all of that are blue and white, those are your colors. Chances are, though, you're probably looking to use other colors in addition to those. You have to make sure that the combination is going to be a good one. And that's really what a lot of this is about. Color is one of those aspects that really can be an important part of our experiences, but there's also some data that I want to share with you from a study that was done. And this was really an eye opener for me. And I wanted to share this with you because some of these things I might have guessed and others I didn't. And I think it's important to know that this, first of all, that this is actually being studied. And of course, anything that might help people make money is going to have a study behind it. But just because it, I think, affects a lot of what we as library kinds of marketers do. So before I keep clicking, let me cover the first one. So 93% of customers buy products based on their visual appearance. This should surprise absolutely nobody. But I'm actually surprised, though, that it's not higher. We all know in libraries that people choose books by the cover, right? We always say, don't judge a book by its cover. And we might think, my favorite book has a terrible cover, but you got past the cover to do that. And maybe you had a lot of help through recommendations or reviews. Most people look at a thing and decide pretty much right away whether or not they want that thing, whether it's a book or anything else. You know, you do the same thing when you go shopping. So that means that when people see colors, that is a big influence on what they think about that thing and whether or not they want that thing. Colors increase brand awareness by 80%. So those of you who were telling me in the chat that our colors are X and Y or X, Y, and Z, that's really important to keep that consistent. You want people to be able to use those colors as kind of a digital signpost to say, yes, this is the library. You knew the shade of blue with us, was us. Someone earlier on mentioned that red and yellow are McDonald's colors. I bet you anything, if I showed you a picture that had two different shades than the ones McDonald's uses, so a different shade of yellow and a different shade of red, you would know right away that's not McDonald's. A deep burgundy and maybe an orangey gold, that's not McDonald's. They use that as part of their brand awareness. You know, to associate specific shades with them. We want that with libraries as well. Now, this one shocked me a little bit. This is about the color blue, and in fact, Janine was just saying in a comment, the inside of our library has a lot of blue in it, so that color works well for us. Well, then this is important for you. Blue is the favorite digital buying color for 35% of women and 57% of men. I would not have expected that the divide there was quite so wide as it is. So if someone else mentioned earlier that they use color dependent on who they're marketing to, which I think is a very good idea. This is something to consider, is that if you have a program that's being marketed specifically to women, 35%, could you still use blue? Of course you can, but you need to be aware that it's not as popular an option as maybe some other things. And the next question you're probably having pop into your head is, well, Laura, if only 35% of women like blue or use it at least to make buying decisions, what color should we use instead? Well, I don't have a good answer for that, and neither does anyone else. The way that this survey was apparently worded doesn't cover that. They just wanted to know how people generally felt about blue when it comes to buying things. 62% of people read your advertisement, and let's be honest, almost everything we do digitally is an advertisement. We don't like to say that, we don't like to admit it, but we are selling things, we are promoting things, we are trying to get people to take an action that has to do with our organization. We are absolutely selling things. But 62% of people will read our advertisements, which could also be social media, if they like the color of your post, which is why we're having this session today, because color is a criteria that more than half of people use as a primary criteria to decide whether or not they're even going to look at your digital stuff. And lastly, 52% of people won't return to a store. Now, this is a physical thing, but I think it's important also, not only for us digitally, of course, but also just in your library. 52% of people, if they don't like the color, the aesthetic, they won't come back. And I'm sure that people who have been involved in a building project or some kind of remodeling project where colors came up, this was a huge deal because colors really do influence how people can feel about a physical space. And as we've seen, and we'll see, also a digital space. People count on color a lot when they are making decisions. So choosing your colors is easy if you know what you're trying to communicate, I think. But before you start communicating, and for those of you who are heavily involved in social media, you may already have this kind of a plan or a document, but you need to know what your library's voice is. If your library's voice is a very sassy, kind of extroverted person, you may want to think about your color choice in that sphere. What do you think the colors are that someone with that kind of voice would use? Because when we're in social media, usually libraries have a voice, hopefully a unified voice, and we want to be consistent with that. Think of your library like a person. Who are they? What's important to them? And how do you determine which colors are going to work best as that quote unquote person? And it really starts first with learning the emotional associations with each color. Now, these are associations. I want to say that. I'm probably going to emphasize it again a little later on. These are purely associations. These are not guarantees. So what that means is that you've probably heard forever, red makes people angry, right? There's not science to back that up. There's nothing that says red will absolutely make people angry. And you know this is true because chances are you're looking at this red slide right now, and chances are, maybe you're a little irritated if you don't love the color red, but you're probably not angry. People have cultural associations with specific colors, and that's what we're going to be leaning heavily into today. And Jamie says, a question from attendee, does the data you mentioned correlate with email? So it doesn't specifically say that, but my guess is because digital is digital, someone doesn't necessarily look at an email and separate that out from an Instagram post. It's all on the screen. So I'm speculating, and you can take it as my speculation, but I would say it would probably correlate. To me, that makes sense. Whether or not that's absolutely true, I can't guarantee. But from a standpoint of someone who's designing specifically for screens, I don't personally see a difference. I don't design differently. I mean, designing for email is kind of a whole different animal from a technical side, but the idea is still to get people to associate your content with a specific idea or a specific feeling. So to me, it wouldn't be different. It's a good question, though. So red, I just mentioned red, right? Red is kind of a difficult color in all kinds of ways, because when you talk about the cultural associations of how people feel or supposed to feel with red, it can make you feel very passionate, very energized. It's certainly the warmest of all the colors, but it can trigger opposing emotions because it's, again, often associated with passion and being energetic, but also we associate with Valentine's Day, right? It's the main color for Valentine's Day coming up. It can actually increase people's heart rate, make them excited. I think that there's a little shady science going on with that one, but that's something it's supposed to be able to do. But if you want to draw attention to a design element, use red. When I hear people talk about how they're going to make colors pop, that's absolutely one of the colors that comes up is red. Is because, and this is why people talk about, and this is not just digital, but the big red button, right? Remember, was it Staples or Home Depot? They had a big red button and had the word easy on it. That was part of their marketing shtick. The big red button, you press it and ta-da, everything is better. Or maybe in some cases, in some movies, the big red button sets off, a nuclear holocaust. But the idea is that it's really important and it's a red button. So you can use it as something that does indeed pop in your design. So it can be used as an accent color for sure, but too much of it can be very overwhelming. You'll definitely, if you start looking at interior design trends, there's definitely some controversy. Well, if you paint this room red, is that going to overwhelm people? I know for a while, kind of a deep burgundy wine color was popular as an interior paint color. In fact, I had an office that color once long ago. I didn't choose that color; it just came with the office. I don't know that it inspired me to feel any differently, but ask yourself: would you want to have dinner in a completely dark red dining room? That may be somewhat controversial. You can let me know in the chat. What do you think of? Would you do that? It used to be a thing. It can inspire different feelings. So I wanted for each of these colors, and Mackenzie says we use it in our library. So is that, Mackenzie, I have to ask, is that like your main color? Is everything red in your library, or is it an accent color? And also, is this the interior color of your library, or is it for marketing? Like, in my experience, the physical library doesn't always match the online marketing piece. So let's say a library's colors are blue and orange, but the blue and orange may not really appear anywhere inside the library other than on marketing materials. And Mackenzie says interior and part of branding. So it could be good because that means there's some consistency. I like that personally. I think it's a better look as far as branding goes. Jessica says, my mom had a burgundy and mustard walls in our living room. It was cozy but cramped. That's an interesting color combination. Of course, I grew up in the days of avocado green appliances and orange shag carpet. So after that, nothing scares you anymore. That was back in the day, and I don't miss that at all. These here on the screen are some things that I've pulled from different library websites. These are not things that I created. These are all from different libraries in different places in the country. What do you think about this? These are different uses of the shade red, or the color red, and different shades of it in different uses. Which of these do you like the most? Which of these do you not like? They're very different, I think, anyway, in terms of how they use that color. Let me know in the chat. What do you think? Angela says, love the one on the far left. I have to admit, Angela, that was my favorite too. Kristen says, I like all of them. Rosalia says, same. I like the far left. I love the love letters ones. We got very popular there on the left. I'd go to anime night, says Mackenzie. Left one's very popular. I think that it really is perfect for the program for sure. And it looks very professional. I enjoy that too. Maggie says the anime night one is rough because the character in the bottom left has a more greenish tone that clashes with the rest of the image. I think you're right. And I hadn't even thought about that consciously, but I'm looking at going, yeah, that actually is probably one of the reasons that it didn't make me go woohoo the first time. Sarah says the left one expresses emotion. Bridget says far left's most striking. The anime could use a little more contrast. Jaden says, I like all of them, but the right one seems to be the least striking. And Jaden, you're not wrong. Even though that color of red actually is not too far off from the one on the left, and it's pretty typical kind of burgundy color. I think part of the problem is there's not enough contrast between the upper and the lower parts. I don't think that the upper one is problematic necessarily, other than it's actually got a kind of a gray overlay with partial opacity over the top. Let's see. Stuff is scrolling by me, so I'm trying to catch up. Gina says, I like the love letters. I think colors and advertising really depend on the vibe, feeling, or program you are trying to promote. And Gina, you're absolutely right. And that is what we're trying. We want people to feel or associate something with us, right? We want people to feel happy or motivated or interested or something. We want, and again, colors can't guarantee that's going to happen, but we can lean into these cultural associations. And people are still commenting here on these designs. Barbara says, I am one of the few who does not care for the one on the left. Something about it is too much. The anime does not grab me. So Barbara, there's nothing wrong with that. And that's really kind of highlights one of the problems with red. A lot of us, I think, were drawn to the design aspect in the sense of the layout and the elements of this thing over on the left, but the color red, I think, can be too much. Now, whether it is in this design, it's all arguable. Absolutely. But it does demonstrate that sometimes it can be a problem. There's no guarantee, no matter what you do or what color you use, that everyone's going to like what you're doing. So let's move on to yellow, which is supposed to inspire feelings of feeling energized and enthusiastic. Sorry, this isn't orange. I'm looking at a picture of an orange saying yellow. Duh. No, it's orange. I meant orange. It's supposed to make you feel. Oh, Jamie says I'm too far behind. I am too far behind. I did not realize that. I have been talking too much. So let's just briefly go through these. And I want to show you some of these. And here are some other orange things. And you can let me know in the chat what you think about these. I'm going to skim through these, and I apologize. I went too long. I thought that I had more time today. So yellow, I saw people originally talking about things about, yeah, and Jeanine says yellow looks happy, clean and bright. I had a hard time finding yellow things, to be honest. I think it's a harder color to use overall. Green, which is my favorite color. Here are some options for green in different ways. I think green is, although it's my favorite color, I think it can be used overly much. These kind of like that. Katie says I like yellow for accents. So libraries are using all kinds of color. And we talked about blue. Here are some things in color, some very different things. Not necessarily in love with all of these, but it shows you that blue, I think honestly, can be a little overwhelming if it's used too much. You have to be careful of every color. What about purple? Purple, I saw some folks talking about color combinations earlier with purple. Here are some examples of, and this may actually be from the same library. They're two different libraries, I think. But you can see here how purple got used as a background. And for blue and green, blue generally is very calm. It inspires a feeling of trust, Kristen. This is one of the reasons that banks tend to use it. A lot of businesses tend to use blue. Green gets associated, of course, with a lot of environmental things, and wealth, also money, at least in the US, money. So those were there. Pink, Valentine's Day is coming up. So pink is really pretty important, I think, coming up anyway. I don't know. I didn't hear anybody talk about pink. And of course, with the Barbie thing, that's something to be considered. I did have an easier time finding things with pink. Personally, I like at least a couple of these. But I think it's a good use of pink, in at least some of these cases. And with all of these, I think it's really important to note that not everything is going to be equivalent. I just want to show you some examples. I haven't heard anybody talk about brown. I feel like brown gets a bad rap for a whole lot of reasons, but it can make you feel much more down to earth. It's supposed to create a sense of stability. It's warm, it's friendly. Here are just a couple examples of brown. Jamie says, I like brown, especially with light blue or pink. Katie says, I like brown for when black is too much. So brown does have feelings that are associated with it. And, you can decide here whether or not brown was a good pick for these. Personally, I think generally, yes. Kristen says brown is earthy. Exactly. Yes. Black is in one that can be hard to work with, even though we're used to white on black. That's basically how papers worked for eons, right? But it does have different kinds of connotations. It can feel very sophisticated and classic and serious. It can evoke luxury, very classy things. It can be very neutral in some cases. It can be simple. It can be bold. But also you have to think about, well, at least in our culture here, black can also mean funerals and mourning. And so too much of it can certainly give the impression of something literally darker or figuratively darker. Here are some examples. I had a hard time, at least at this point, finding things that really focused on black as the main color. It is used a lot in accents, and I think that's right. And sometimes I think it can be used very effectively as the main color. I like at least a couple of these. You can let me know how you feel about those in the chat. Now, that leads lastly to white, and white is usually associated with minimalism and simplicity. And so using a lot of white color in a design can create a sort of minimalistic aesthetic. also can make it very fresh, very clean. When I work with libraries on websites, the number one thing I hear when it comes to website design is we want a clean design. When libraries say that to me, they may not realize it, but what they're really looking for is white space, literal white space. They want white space around elements so that things aren't all cluttered. And but Mackenzie says white feels so empty and boring. Gina says white space can be your friend. So see, we've got some differing opinions there, just like with every color. I had a hard time finding things where white was just kind of the color. So I had to end up having to find things where it was simply the background. And really, probably that's the way white works most of the time. It's very hard to distinguish anything else because white is often the default. So finding something that's like, white is hard because white is the default. But all of that is to say that color is still subjective because we saw that just in the chat here today. What makes one person feel cheerful can make another person irritated, or they don't like it, or they don't want a whole room or maybe a whole Instagram post full of that color. So it's not completely agreed on. It can appeal differently to different people in different situations, but colors and emotions are still pretty closely linked. So you have to take their effects into account. Sometimes you'll see things like this. Maggie says, when I was taking digital video editing in classes in school, we were advised not to use pure white in our projects. He never went into detail about why, though. I guess I could see that for video, Maggie. I'm not sure how that would play out on things that are static, like social media or websites, because it is kind of the default. But we could talk about probably Instagram just as a general thing for a while. I honestly think that white backgrounds on Instagram, not great. I don't think it attracts enough attention because usually the user interface for Instagram is kind of white, so it doesn't stand out. And that may also be the case, I think, anyway, with things like Facebook. When you have the whole background is already white, you're not getting something that stands out. So maybe that's what your professor was talking about. I'm not sure, but that's an interesting thought. So we have to take this stuff into account. We need to know how colors and feelings are connected. Again, there's no guarantee that if you make something green that people are going to feel all healthy, wealthy, and wise about it. There's just a cultural association with that we can play on. Here's a quote that I thought was particularly pertinent here. So the idea that colors such as yellow or purple are able to evoke some kind of hyper-specific emotion is about as accurate as your standard tarot card reading. Just another reminder that we can't say, well, if we use this shade of orange, people are going to feel very energized when they see our post and they're going to want to come in and do this program. There's nothing like that can happen. You can only say, well, people associate this color with XYZ, and we should use that to promote this particular thing. And that's not irrelevant. That's not unimportant. Knowing these associations actually can really help you because you want to play into that kind of thing. People have specific associations with specific emotions. That's what we want. So best practices, things to do or don't do with colors, because although you can't rely on color just to inspire a specific emotion, it does have to be part of this decision-making process. And so there's some best practices that we should be using. And Lori says, yes, instead of black text on pure white background, you want a touch of gray, off-white instead of white for accessibility. Extreme contrast can cause issues for some. Yep, Lori, that is true. And also I sort of specialize in web accessibility. I can tell you there's even more issues when contrast is bad between colors other than black and white. A lot of things that if I start doing testing on a lot of promotional pieces from libraries, that's probably one of the biggest concerns that comes up, is that there's not enough contrast. Even if you think there is contrast, like white on, let's say, a medium shade of green, you're like, I look at it, it's fine. People with low vision may not be able to see that at all. And there are tools for that that you can use to test that if you're interested, for sure. Okay, contrast. Well, I forgot this was coming up, believe it or not, and perfect, because I just segued myself. Using color contrast to grab attention is really, really important. I just mentioned a minute ago about how the interface for both Instagram and Facebook, they're white. That's kind of the default for so many things. So having colors on top of white or another color, something that's going to pop. That's something I've seen at least a few times in the chat today, where people have used specific colors to pop in some way. We have to make sure that's happening, obviously for an accessibility reason, but also just so people can see your things and be attracted to them. So here's some logos, and you can see those here. And the idea is that these have pretty decent contrast, and they're going to attract more attention because they can see these things. And usually they'll also show up well in, for example, grayscale. And Angela, you're a little biased. Angela formerly is of Cincinnati. But yes, I do like their new branding. It's far better than it was. And Kristen says, yes, nice, but I can also see the different whites. And part of that may be me, Kristen, because these were all screenshots that have been probably optimized at some point along the way. So they may or may not be on different shades of white. I tend to think in reality, probably not. That's okay, Kristen. I just want to be clear that this isn't all on them. So contrast is really important, not just the colors that you use. Color combinations, remember, I started this at the very, very beginning, right? We started with this almost exact color wheel. We have to remember there are complementary color combinations, and you don't want to be using things. Yes, you can get away with 2 shades of blue right next to each other, like you're seeing down there in the color wheel, but that may not be great for some applications. It's generally better, especially contrast, huge thing, to go to a complementary color, maybe directly across the color wheel. Blue and orange is one I was just talking about a minute ago. I know a few libraries that have that combination. And I've seen people talk about red and green for various reasons throughout the session today. So when in doubt, there are probably the best route to go is to something like this. But there are other tools. I'm actually going to give you a list of tools you can get that will help you make different color combinations. There's probably hundreds of them, and I've narrowed it down to a few. This is something else we've kind of danced around a good bit during the session today, and that is consistency of colors in your library's branding. If you're using, because I can tell you from my own experience doing websites for libraries, this is a hard thing to come by. Some of you might be going, what? Yes, there are many times when I have libraries that send me a logo. And first of all, for the people who work in print, they do not send me any kind of vector, and which drives me nuts. For those of you who understand that, you know why. So they'll send, all they have is like a PNG file, which is a raster file. And they're like, here's our new logo. And usually it's somebody designed it in-house who didn't have any professional training, and you can tell. And then they say, here are the colors, and they want the website in those colors. And then they don't really have those colors other places. And I'm not talking about just their physical building, although it's nice when you can carry that theme throughout. But sometimes on their other marketing, for those folks who are here from the marketing realm, that probably horrifies you, but it happens all the time. So making sure that your colors are consistent across all of your promotional stuff, across all of your marketing, all of your branding, everything. If you're using blue and orange, it should be everywhere. Maybe not in huge amounts, but you should have it so that people will recognize it. Remember McDonald's specific shades of yellow and red? You want that for your library. You also want to have some consistency in terms of what you're using as far as your marketing goes. So I'm not saying I love this design or not. But at the very least, I can identify this. Even if they took the logo of the library off of this, I can identify it. And it goes with their colors. And there's lots to be said for consistency in design and people recognizing your stuff as your stuff. I've seen too many times people go overboard when they first were, especially in the past, when they were exposed to something like Photoshop and they had 216 million colors to choose from. People would go nuts. I still see it with fonts. I see it in Word documents. Maybe you have also where people are like, I can use all of these colors, and so I will. And that becomes a very unfortunate marketing hot mess for lots and lots of reasons. Using too many colors in your marketing piece can be overwhelming. some of you were already overwhelmed or didn't enjoy some of the examples I showed you earlier. And it makes it harder for people to focus on your content as well because they're too busy being overwhelmed. So stick to a limited color palette. You get a cleaner, more cohesive look. And Mackenzie says, I find 3 tops is good. I would generally agree with that, although it's interesting. Most web palettes actually go to 5. And that has to do because there's different elements that have to basically pop in different ways. But 3 is not a bad rule of thumb. Janine says, I agree that too many colors can be overwhelming. This is actually one of the reasons I really appreciate tools like Canva for folks who are not professionals, because I have long said that it's very difficult to make something bad in Canva. With those templates, they've got it all worked out for you. I think that's awesome. When you can, test it. If you think that shade of red might be too much, nothing wrong with getting a small group of, not your staff, but patrons and testing it, especially if you're going through a whole branding redesign kind of a thing, like Angela was talking about with Cincinnati. I'm sure they didn't just sit some staff down in a back room somewhere and have a meeting and say, what are our new colors going to be? I'm sure they probably ran that through a whole bunch of different kinds of focus groups. And it doesn't take much to have a focus group. You can get 5 different people together and be, ta-da, focus group. That's literally all you need. That number is the minimum. So test this stuff before you start using it. And that's not to say test everything you're going to use, like, for example, on Instagram, but especially when you're thinking about rebranding your libraries, colors, as we saw, are so critical. I mentioned that I would give you a list of tools that you could grab. These are just a few that I have colored. I don't do coloring books, things that I have used to manage or think about colors. I'm going to put this into the chat. And while I'm doing that, if you have other questions, please type those into the chat as well. Color tools.pdf. I think I got that. So if you want to take a look at that, that's a sort of short and sweet list. I really can't talk today. I apologize. List of things that you can use. I just put that in the chat. Sorry, Jamie, if you could put that in the full chat, I'd appreciate that. It is designforlittleguide.com/colortools.pdf. I know we're almost at time, but I wanted to make sure that I addressed any questions that you might have. Hopefully that you have gotten some more things to think about with colors and think a little differently maybe about how you're using color in some of your library's promotions.
Wow, Laura, I thought that webinar was really fun. I loved all the conversation in the chat and all the exchanging, and of course, a lot of great information. I feel like you did a really great job of watching the chat and addressing any questions. One question I'm asking all of our presenters today is, why do you think if someone asked you if they should work at a public library, why would you say they should? Or why?
Oh, wow. Oh, boy.
Now I'm putting everyone on the spot, so don't.
Yeah, obviously I should have tuned in earlier so I could have been prepared for that one.
I want your off the cuff response, or what just comes to your head.
Wow. Well, there's all of the sort of standard reasons of protect democracy, educate the populace, providing public service, and I try to balance that out with all the reasons not to work in a public library. But you know what, here's my answer, here's my real answer. One of the most interesting things that I have personally found in my experience working in public libraries and for public libraries is that I never get bored. No information that I've ever learned has probably ever gone to waste. Everything I've ever done before or ever will do has somehow become applicable, and my job has never been narrow. No matter what position I've been in, there's been so much opportunity to do more than that, for better, for worse.
I love that. Thank you. Thank you again, all of you in attendance for today and for participating in the chat. As I mentioned before, the recording and the slides will be available on the website by Monday. So that was the first webinar in our marketing track. The next one is at 1 p.m. and that one is on storytelling for impact. So eat a little lunch, take a stretch break. I hope to see you at some of that. Many of you at that session. If not, have a great rest of your day, and so long.